Helen. I'm a policy advisor at DFT, and I've been asked along today just to talk a bit about the Future Transport Programme and particularly Mobility as a Service, which is the policy area that I specialise in. So just going to give you all a little bit of, I guess, context as to kind of where MAS sits in the department, some of the ongoing work we have to do with MAS, and particularly the Code of Practice, which is kind of the big sort of strategy that we're working on at the moment. So yeah, just to give a bit of context, the department established the Future Transport Programme to respond to some of the radical changes that we saw coming in transport. It has a few main objectives: to stimulate innovation in the UK transport sector, to prepare the UK for the opportunities that are kind of coming now and in the future. Really importantly, to create new zero emission transport markets and the frameworks that can enable them. To realise a safe, secure and accessible transport system that's kind of fit for the future and accessible to all members of society, and also to secure the UK's position within the mobility market. So that's just a bit of like the background as to where this sort of work sits. And these graphics just kind of illustrate a few of the modes and new technologies that we sort of focus on in the Future Transport Programme. So there's four kind of, I suppose, buckets of work that sort of sit within the programme. So firstly, we have our urban strategy that was published back in 2019, and it's available on Gov.uk. I'll try and pop some links in the chat to some of the documents that I'll reference if it's kind of useful for people. So yeah, that kind of sets out the principles that sort of guide our response to emerging transport tech, new business models, and innovations, particularly within kind of urban and city environments, and just helping cities harness those kind of opportunities that are emerging. We also have kind of in conjunction with that, very importantly, our rural strategy, which is something we're currently working on at the moment. So very similar, that kind of outlines how future transport solutions and innovations can tackle specific issues for rural mobility in rural areas and help those kind of services become a bit more integrated. We also have a regulatory review angle to the programme, which is looking at kind of, regulation, addressing some of the gaps that might exist there and looking to sort of remove barriers to help enable innovation. And finally, we have an experimentation and trialling arm of the programme. So we have 4 future transport zones across the country. I think off the top of my head, they are Southampton, sort of Bristol, the West Midlands and Nottingham and Derby as well. So they're 4 sort of local authority areas that we've given some funding to help them trial lots of different innovations in mobility, e-scooter trials being kind of a big part of that, but also MAS as well has formed a big part of it. And so we're kind of working really closely with those local authorities and various other organisations to help them set up pilot programmes and trialling and testing so we can kind of see how these things might work in the real world and kind of on a fairly large scale. So as part of our programme, we have some future transport principles, and these are taken from the urban strategy that I mentioned previously. I thought it was just kind of worth adding these into the presentation because I think they really help sort of sum up the principles that kind of guide all of the work that we do, and sort of worth highlighting a few here. As you can see, there's a few that really speak to sort of MAS and the ambitions we have for MAS around kind of sharing data from kind of new mobility services, making sure new mobility services are kind of integrated, and combining sort of multiple modes of transport. So yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of way that we kind of guide our work, and you can see how a lot of these sort of relate back to MAS as well. So MAS at DFT more specifically, so again, in our future mobility urban strategy, we have a definition of MAS, which I thought was always quite useful to include for those who may not be familiar with the concept, or I know there's kind of various definitions out there, but this is how we as a department kind of define MAS. So that is the integration of various modes of transport along with information and payment functions into a single mobility service. And that's how sort of we define it. We've had a few various bits of work kind of ongoing over the past few years to sort of understand more about MAS and how it can kind of improve the transport network and reach kind of net zero targets. In August last year, we published some deliberative research, which was a really interesting piece that was aimed at understanding the role of MAS in encouraging the uptake of more sustainable travel behaviours. So really looking at that kind of like behavioural shift and how MAS can sort of play a role in that. And again, I'll try and link that in the chat because it's worth a read. It's some interesting stuff in there. As I mentioned, we've got our 4 future transport zones, so they're providing us with some real world testing of MAS deployment. Particularly worth mentioning the Solent region, who are one of our zones, have in the last sort of month or so actually launched their first MAS app. and that is now live and sort of being used, and that's part of the funding that we've given them. So it's been great to see that kind of come to fruition and be sort of out there in the real world. And then finally, as a department, we released our decarbonising transport, or decarb transport plan, last year, which is a really kind of ambitious, wide-ranging document, which kind of looked at how we could kind of decarbonise the whole of the transport system in the UK. But as part of that document, we had a clear commitment in there to consult on a MAS code of practice. The idea being that we are sort of signalling our intent for how we want MAS to help shape the transport outcomes that we want in the future. And that consultation was actually the third in a series of public consultations we've held on MAS and to sort of better understand MAS over the last sort of 2 or 3 years. So the code of practice itself, the reasons why we're kind of introducing that, our thinking was really that taking kind of a voluntary approach is going to enable us to support MAS as it's growing, kind of without introducing any kind of onerous regulations onto the industry at a time that could stifle innovation. It is a very emerging market in the UK. And really, we kind of thought, a voluntary approach through a code of practice is going to provide sort of support and guidance without being too overbearing on industry. And also it provides us with an opportunity to gather some further evidence in quite a structured way, so we can understand how the code's being taken up, how it's being used, and that can inform discussions in the future about where regulation might need to be brought forward. There's a few aims of the code that we've identified. So we're hoping that it will kind of aid navigation around relevant legislation, support new businesses in the industry to make their decisions in line with government goals and government ambition for MAS, to encourage MAS platform providers to include carbon data for each route offered. That was quite a specific ambition that we set out in the Transport Decarb Plan. To ensure MAS services are inclusive and accessible to all customers from the outset. We're going to provide some best practice examples of MAS solutions as well to give people a kind of a case study approach to how they can kind of get their MAS schemes going. And finally, to assist local authorities in developing or considering MAS platforms to operate in their areas, they can help sort of develop local solutions that are built on nationally agreed sort of standards. So the code itself, we had a consultation that ran in February to May this year. And that was a public consultation, just to kind of get an idea of how people might want the kind of content to develop of the code, what people might want to see of the code and how it could work. We received a really strong response. We had 66 responses from a really wide range of stakeholders. So of course, MAS platform providers themselves, local authorities and transport operators, so charities and lobby groups kind of fed in as well. So we got a really good sense of what the code should look like, what it should cover, and how it can be most useful to all the organisations that have an interest in MAS. The bullet points I've listed here are kind of the areas that we structured the consultation around, which have sort of informed the content of the code and the structure of the code itself. So to give you an idea of what it's going to cover, data kind of obviously forms a really big part of it. So there's a big section on kind of data, so modal data standardization, data sharing. Of course, multimodal ticketing is a really complex kind of area. So we'll look to sort of provide some helpful kind of guidelines and recommendations on multimodal ticketing schemes. Accessibility and inclusion, really importantly, making sure that when MAS schemes are developed, that accessibility needs are sort of baked in from the beginning. So things can be accessible to everybody. Consumer protection is another quite complex area. Making sure consumers understand if they're purchasing a multimodal ticket, what their rights are, how they might claim compensation if that's needed. Making sure data protection is kind of addressed as well. We also talk a bit about algorithmic bias and promoting active and sustainable travel. So looking at the idea of how MAS apps might be promoting or kind of encouraging certain modes over others, making sure that active and sustainable travel is really kind of at the forefront of options that are given to people in a MAS app, and making sure that that's still prioritised. And finally, competition issues. As I mentioned, the MAS industry is very kind of emerging in the UK. We're unsure how that's going to develop over the next few years. So just being sort of aware to those issues of potential sort of monopolisation or any kind of competition issues that may arise in the market as it grows over the next few years. So they're the sort of main, I guess, overarching topics that we're looking to address through the code itself. And yeah, just finally, we're hoping to publish the code this year. We're kind of reaching the end of the sort of drafting stages of the content, which is fantastic. And we've had some, yeah, as I said, some great feedback from the industry. So yeah, hopeful that that will be kind of out there in the public domain for you all to see very soon. But yeah, that's it from me. So yeah, very happy to take any questions, and thank you.
I'm back, hopefully. Hi, Helen. Thank you very much for that. That was brilliant to breeze through sort of what we're looking for from the DFT around mobility as a service. So one question, originally a comment that's sort of come in from Mike, is around the voluntary approach of the code of practice. Now, whilst it could allow for innovation, is there a risk that actually we could end up with a variety of different / incompatible systems, which actually could be hard to integrate in the future? So are we going down a route perhaps of accidentally allowing so much sort of openness to everything that without it being constrained, it all kind of doesn't really talk to one another, and it's just a bunch of disparate systems?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I'll just kind of reiterate what I said. I think our approach is very much that because the industry is so small and sort of emerging within the UK, we kind of wanted to, I suppose, let industry lead the way initially, sort of see how that goes. And with a code of practice, we can kind of give a bit of a guiding voice without being anything kind of being too onerous or sort of dictating what technology or things should be used at a time when the market is so emerging. So yeah, I guess I just reiterate that was really the rationale behind why we made that decision. And it's very much the case that we'll kind of monitor and evaluate how the code's being taken up. And that, I think, will lead us to see where potentially regulations or stronger sort of things might need to be brought in the future.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. One question that came through on an earlier talk today that I think is still quite applicable actually for this in terms of code of practice is how are we ensuring actually that we are creating an inclusive system for mobility as a service? So again, if we're opening it out to lots of sort of private enterprise to come in and do things now, private enterprise will normally sort of look at trying to make things the most efficient for their business case. And that's understandable how businesses operate. But how do we ensure actually what we're trying to get out there in terms of our code of practice is a solution that benefits perhaps people that don't have the loudest voices to be able to voice concerns around how things are changing around them?
Yeah, it's such an important point, and it's something that was really at the forefront of our minds as we were creating this code. Very aware that yeah, MAS can have some exclusion issues, particularly digital exclusion. Not everybody has a mobile phone, not everybody has an online bank account. There's lots of issues there that have the potential to exclude people from using these kind of services. And so yeah, through the code, we've got kind of quite a really big chapter on kind of accessibility inclusion and giving some quite strong recommendations to industry about how we would like to see them, as I said, prioritizing, baking this in from the start, making sure when you're designing those schemes that you're considering all aspects of society and who might use these services, and using those people throughout the design process. So kind of consulting with them as you're designing these apps, making sure it's fully accessible to everyone. And yeah, it's a really important point. I think hopefully the code will outline how the importance of that to us and how we want sort of industry to take that on.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We've got another question that's come in from Stephen, which is have you considered an overarching systems perspective for the cybersecurity? So you've got the data privacy that goes in there, but also what's about the risks of operability of the system? So if you have, say, one of the nodes or one of the providers of data going down, does that completely tank out the rest of your mobility as a service platform?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very good question. Not one I've thought of, to be honest. Cybersecurity angle, I guess that's a bit beyond kind of what we're trying to do with the code, I suppose. But yeah, as I mentioned, kind of certainly data privacy has been definitely at the forefront of our minds. And through the consultation, actually, it was a theme that came out very strongly from people sort of saying, yeah, that data privacy was something that, they wanted to make sure it was clear that users understood how their data was being used, that, yeah, any organizations that are sharing data are kind of applying the relevant regulations. So yeah, but no, I have to say cybersecurity not something that's been on our radar, to be honest, but it's an interesting one.
Oh, brilliant, thank you very much. Just one other one that comes to my mind at the moment as well is in terms of then actually supporting the businesses, how would we ensure, or how is MAS going to ensure that businesses are comfortable really getting involved and sharing this? Because they would, I imagine there'll be the apprehension of, if I reveal all of my cards to you, I could be held on the hook for something that's gone wrong that perhaps wasn't necessarily our fault, and it could potentially get in the way of what is already the, albeit very complicated, but the attribution system that exists with Network Rail, for example.
Yeah, I would definitely say there's a big sort of like challenge there with sort of getting all these modes and operators to kind of sing from the same hymn sheet and kind of get, um, involved in these MAS schemes. And I know from working with some local authorities closely, like that's a challenge that they faced, is sort of getting the benefits of MAS really clearly kind of brought over to operators. So I think, for sure it's a challenge, but I think hopefully with the code, this will be kind of the first publication that government have put forward to sort of show, we think MAS is really good. These are all the benefits of MAS. This is why we think you should get involved. And I think something like that will hopefully help local authorities or other or MAS platform providers or whoever to kind of, really, sell the benefits and show that there's kind of government, momentum behind that as well.
Brilliant stuff.